One man stood on an airfield in France, watching the horizon turn black, not with storm clouds, but with thousands of Allied aircraft, wave after wave after wave. The sound alone was enough to make the ground tremble. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated fighter aces, a man who had flown against the best pilots the Allies had to offer, stood there with a cigarette in his hand, and for the first time in his career, he felt fear. Not the fear of death, not the fear of combat, but something far worse, the fear of inevitability. Because in that moment, watching those thousands of planes fill the sky like a mechanical storm, he realized something that would change the course of history. The war was already over. Germany had lost. And nobody in Berlin was willing to admit it yet. But here's what nobody tells you about that morning, what Galland saw, what he felt, and what he knew would happen next. Stay with me. Because what unfolded in the sky over Normandy on June 6, 1944, wasn't just a battle, it was the moment the Third Reich's fate was sealed forever. To understand why this moment was so devastating, you need to understand who Adolf Galland was. This wasn't just any officer. This was a man who had become a legend in the Luftwaffe. He'd flown in the Spanish Civil War, he'd commanded squadrons during the Blitzkrieg across Poland and France, he'd dueled with Spitfires over the English Channel during the Battle of Britain, and won more often than not. Picture this, a young, confident pilot in his perfectly pressed uniform, cigar clenched between his teeth, climbing into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 with the kind of swagger that only comes from knowing you're the best at what you do. In 1940, the Luftwaffe was the most feared air force on the planet. When German bombers appeared over Warsaw, the city fell in days. When they flew over Rotterdam, the Dutch surrendered. When they targeted London during the Blitz, Churchill himself watched the sky burn from his bunker. The Luftwaffe wasn't just winning, it was dominating. Galland himself had over 100 confirmed kills by 1942. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Germany's highest military honors. He was respected, feared, and celebrated. But here's the thing about war that people often forget. Early success can blind you to future failure. See, while Galland was racking up victories and Germany was celebrating its air superiority, something was happening across the Atlantic. Something that would eventually tip the scales so dramatically that no amount of German skill or bravery could overcome it. The United States was waking up, and when America wakes up, it doesn't just enter a war, it industrializes it. By 1943, American factories were pumping out aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible. We're talking about one B-24 Liberator bomber rolling off the assembly line every 63 minutes. One P-50 Mustang fighter every hour. The numbers were staggering. Meanwhile, in Germany, Allied bombing campaigns were systematically destroying their factories. Skilled workers were being conscripted to the front lines, resources were drying up, and the pilots, the irreplaceable, highly trained pilots, were dying faster than they could be replaced. Galland saw all of this happening. He argued with Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, begging for more resources, better training programs, newer technology. But Göring, bloated with pride and denial, refused to listen. And so, by the time June 6, 1944 rolled around, the Luftwaffe wasn't just weakened, it was on life support. Which brings us back to that airfield near Paris where Galland stood, watching the dawn break over Normandy. June 6, 1944, 5:47 a.m., northern France. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to bleed over the fields of Normandy. The sky was painted in streaks of pale orange and gunmetal gray, the kind of morning that, under different circumstances, might have been beautiful. But this morning was different. Galland had barely slept. He'd spent the night in a makeshift command post, chain-smoking cigarettes and reviewing intelligence reports that all said the same thing. Something big is coming. The Allies were planning an invasion. Everyone knew it. The question wasn't if, it was where and when. He stepped outside, adjusting his leather gloves, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. His uniform, once immaculate, was now creased from too many sleepless nights. His face, hardened by years of combat, showed the strain. And then he heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a low hum, a vibration in the air, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before you actually hear it. Galland froze, his eyes narrowed. He tilted his head, listening. The hum grew louder and louder and louder. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't thunder, it was something far more terrifying. It was engines, thousands of them. He grabbed his binoculars with hands that had started to shake, not from fear, but from the realization of what was about to happen. He raised them to his eyes and adjusted the focus. And what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sky, from east to west, from north to south, was filled with aircraft. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. C-47 Dakota transports, their bellies full of paratroopers, stretching into the distance like a river of silver. Above them, P-51 Mustangs and Supermarine Spitfires darted in tight formations, weaving patterns of discipline and overwhelming power. Behind them, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lumbered forward, their bomb bays loaded with enough explosives to flatten entire German defensive positions. The metallic flash of their wings caught the early morning sun, creating a visual spectacle that was both beautiful and horrifying. Galland stood there, binoculars pressed against his face, unable to move, unable to speak. The sheer scale of what he was witnessing was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He'd fought in major aerial battles before. He'd seen large formations, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't a battle formation, it was an airborne invasion, a mechanical armada that seemed to stretch into infinity. An officer came running up to him, out of breath, face pale. "Herr General, reconnaissance reports are coming in from all along the coast." Galland didn't lower his binoculars. "How many?" His voice was steady but cold. The officer hesitated. His hands were shaking as he held the report. They estimate thousands, sir, possibly over 10,000 aircraft in total." Galland finally lowered the binoculars. He turned to look at the young officer, and for a moment, neither man spoke. 10,000 aircraft? To put that in perspective, the entire Luftwaffe across all fronts, including the Eastern Front against the Soviets, the Mediterranean, and the defense of Germany itself, had maybe 300 operational aircraft left, total, and the Allies had just thrown more than 3 times that number into the sky over Normandy in a single morning. Galland lit another cigarette, his third of the morning. The smoke drifted around him as he stared at the horizon. The sound of those engines was now a constant roar, a deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to shake the very air itself. He could see contrails beginning to form, white streaks across the pale blue sky, like scars being carved into the heavens. "This is it," he muttered, almost to himself. "This is the invasion." The officer nodded nervously. "Should we scramble our fighters, sir?" Galland took a long drag from his cigarette. He thought about the aircraft he had available. Maybe 24 Messerschmitt Bf-109s scattered across nearby airfields, maybe another dozen Focke-Wulf FW-190s if they were lucky. Most of them are patched together with spare parts. Most of them are running on fumes because fuel shipments had been disrupted by Allied bombing. And the pilots? Half of them are teenagers with less than 50 hours of flight time. The experienced aces, the men who might have stood a chance, were dead, captured, or stationed elsewhere. Sending them up against that armada would be suicide. But what choice did he have? Orders were orders, and more importantly, honor demanded it. "Yes," he finally said, "scramble them, but tell the squadron leaders, tell them to be smart. If they're outnumbered more than 2 to 1, they retreat. "I won't waste lives for nothing." The officer saluted and ran toward the communications tent. Gallant stayed where he was, watching the sky darken with aircraft. Somewhere beyond those clouds, he knew, paratroopers were already leaping into the darkness. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, had begun. And in that moment, Adolf Galland, who had once believed the Luftwaffe was invincible, felt the crushing weight of reality settle over him. Every single one of those Allied planes represented something Germany could no longer produce: industrial capacity, trained pilots, fuel reserves, spare parts, hope. Months of relentless Allied bombing had gutted Germany's factories. The synthetic fuel plants were destroyed. The aircraft production facilities were rubble. The training schools were running on empty. The Allies, meanwhile, were producing aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. For every Mustang destroyed, 2 more rolled off the assembly line. For every bomber that went down, 3 more took its place. It was a war of attrition, and Germany was losing. Galland heard the distant rumble of naval guns echoing inland from the coast. The ground beneath his feet trembled. He knew what that meant. Allied battleships and destroyers were bombarding the beaches, softening up German defenses before the landing craft arrived. The invasion was happening on land, sea, and air simultaneously. And Germany, stretched thin across multiple fronts, simply didn't have the resources to stop it. He looked down at his hands. They were steady now. The initial shock had passed, replaced by something colder, something more final: acceptance. "We've lost the air," he whispered to himself. And without air superiority, everything else would crumble. The tanks, the artillery, the defensive positions, all of it would be obliterated from above. The German soldiers fighting on the beaches wouldn't stand a chance. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the endless stream of Allied aircraft. The wind carried the faint thud of bombs exploding in the distance, and the rattling drone of engines that seemed to stretch beyond imagination. For years, Galland and his fellow officers had believed in the invincibility of the Reich, its machines, its strategies, its destiny. But this sky, this morning, shattered that illusion completely. It wasn't the sound of thunder filling the air over Normandy that day. It was the sound of inevitability. Now, before we continue with what happened next, and trust me, it gets even more intense, I want to take a quick moment. If you're fascinated by these untold stories from World War II, the moments that changed history but rarely get the attention they deserve, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Alright, let's get back to it, because what happened over the next few hours would prove just how right Galland was about losing the air. Mechanics scrambled across the tarmac, shouting orders, hauling fuel cans, checking ammunition belts. Pilots, some of them looking barely old enough to drive a car, let alone fly a fighter plane, pulled on their flight suits and grabbed their helmets. Galland watched from a distance as a group of Messerschmitt Bf-109s prepared for takeoff. These planes had once been the pride of the Luftwaffe, sleek, deadly, feared by every Allied pilot who encountered them. But now they looked tired. The camouflage paint was chipped and faded. The fuselages were patched with mismatched metal panels scavenged from wrecked aircraft. One plane had a replacement propeller that didn't quite match the others. You could hear the difference in the engine pitch. One by one, the engines coughed to life, belching thick black smoke into the morning air. The sound was familiar to Galland, once thrilling, the roar of German engineering and power. But today, it sounded desperate. His aide, Oberst Peterson, jogged over with a clipboard, his face grim. "Sir, reconnaissance has confirmed Allied landings across multiple beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. We're estimating at least 6 divisions hitting the coast simultaneously, with more in reserve. Paratroopers have secured key bridges and crossroads inland." Galland didn't need the detailed breakdown. He already knew what those numbers meant: overwhelming force, coordinated to perfection. "What about our coastal defenses?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Peterson hesitated. Being suppressed, sir. Allied naval bombardment is hitting everything. Bunkers, artillery positions, communication lines. And the air support? He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the sky. Galland nodded. He understood. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impenetrable coastal defense system, was being pounded into rubble by Allied firepower. And without air cover, the German soldiers manning those positions were sitting ducks. "The fighters are ready, sir," Peterson said quietly. Galland looked over at the Messerschmitts lined up on the runway. 12 of them. 12 aircraft against what he'd just seen in the sky. He thought about giving the order to stand down, to preserve what little they had left, but he knew he couldn't do that, not because it would be tactically sound to send them up, it wouldn't be, but because those pilots needed to believe they were doing something, that their fight still mattered. And maybe, just maybe, they'd get lucky and disrupt a bombing run, save a few lives on the ground, buy a little more time. "Tell them to focus on the bombers," Galland ordered. "Ignore the fighters if they can. Hit the transports and the heavy bombers. And if they're outnumbered, if they're facing more than they can handle, they retreat immediately. No heroism. We need pilots more than we need martyrs." Peterson nodded and ran toward the control shack to relay the orders. Within minutes, the Messerschmitts began their takeoff sequence. The first two roared down the runway, their wheels lifting off the cracked concrete, climbing into the gray morning light. Galland watched them go, following their ascent until they were just specks against the enormous sky. And then he saw what they were flying into. A formation of P-51 Mustangs, maybe 50 or 60 of them, cruising at medium altitude, escorting a group of bombers headed inland. The Mustangs were sleek, fast, deadly, painted with distinctive checkerboard patterns and squadron markings that showed they were veterans. And they outnumbered the German fighters 5-1. Galland's jaw tightened. He wanted to call them back, to order them to land before it was too late. But it was already too late. The two groups spotted each other almost immediately. The Mustangs broke formation, diving toward the Messerschmitts with practiced precision. The German pilots scattered, trying to gain altitude, trying to maneuver into defensive positions, but there were just too many. Galland could see it all playing out from the ground, the tight turning circles, the brief flashes of gunfire, the smoke trails that marked hits. It was over in less than 3 minutes. One Messerschmitt took a burst of .50 caliber rounds through the engine and immediately began trailing black smoke. The pilot tried to keep control, tried to glide back toward friendly territory, but the damage was too severe. The plane nosed down and disappeared behind a line of trees. A second later, a column of smoke rose from the forest. Another German fighter, piloted by one of the younger recruits, panicked and dove too steeply trying to escape. The wings couldn't handle the stress, they sheared off, and the plane tumbled out of the sky like a broken toy. A third Messerschmitt managed to get a few shots off, maybe even scored a hit on one of the Mustangs. Galland couldn't tell from this distance. But then 3 American fighters converged on it simultaneously. Tracer rounds tore through the cockpit and fuel tank. The plane exploded mid-air, a brief orange fireball that scattered debris across the sky. The remaining German fighters, those that were still airborne, immediately broke off and ran for home, engines screaming as they pushed to maximum throttle. The Mustangs didn't pursue. They didn't need to. They'd already won. Galland watched as 5 Messerschmitts limped back to the airfield. 5 out of 12. 7 planes lost. 7 pilots, some of them dead, others bailing out over enemy territory where they'd be captured or shot on sight. And they hadn't even managed to reach the bombers. As the surviving fighters touched down, their landing gear screeching against the runway, Galland walked toward them. Mechanics rushed forward to assess the damage. Every single returning aircraft was riddled with bullet holes. One had half its tail blown off. Another was leaking hydraulic fluid all over the tarmac. The pilots climbed out, their faces pale, their flight suits soaked with sweat. Some of them were shaking. One young man, couldn't have been more than 19, pulled off his helmet and immediately vomited onto the ground. Galland approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "How many did you face?" he asked gently. The pilot wiped his mouth, his eyes wide with shock. "Too many, sir. We couldn't even get close. They were everywhere. Every direction we turned, there were more of them. We couldn't even see the ground through all the planes." That last sentence hung in the air like a death sentence. We couldn't even see the ground. That was the war now. That was reality. The Allies had so completely dominated the airspace that German pilots couldn't even navigate by visual landmarks anymore. The sky itself had become the enemy. Galland nodded slowly. "You did well to come back. Get some rest. We'll need you again soon." The young pilot nodded weakly and stumbled toward the barracks, supported by a mechanic. Galland turned away, pulling out another cigarette. His hands were steady, but his mind racing. 7 planes, in less than 5 minutes. At this rate, the Luftwaffe wouldn't last the week. He walked toward the edge of the runway, where the smoke from burning wrecks, both on the ground and in the distance, drifted across the fields like funeral shrouds. The sound of aircraft engines was constant now, a deep mechanical roar that never seemed to fade. Somewhere to the west, he could hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of bombs hitting German defensive positions. Each explosion sent a small tremor through the ground. Galland thought about Hermann Göring, his superior, the man who'd once promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would never allow enemy aircraft to fly over German soil. Göring, who even now was probably in some comfortable headquarters, far from the fighting, making excuses and blaming everyone but the disaster unfolding. Galland had argued with him for years, begged him to invest in better training programs, to prioritize fuel production, to develop the jet fighters that might give Germany a technological edge. But Göring had refused. He'd been too arrogant, too convinced of his own genius, too unwilling to admit that Germany was losing the industrial war. And now, here they are, watching the sky fill with enemy aircraft while their own planes fall from the sky like broken birds. Galland took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. He thought about something he'd said years ago, back in 1940, during a conversation with fellow pilots. They'd been celebrating a victory, drinking cognac, feeling invincible. Someone had joked, "What will it take for Germany to lose this war?" And Galland, half drunk and full of confidence, had laughed and said, "The day I look up and see Allied planes flying unopposed over Germany, that's the day I'll know we've lost." It had been a joke then, a ridiculous hypothetical. But standing here, watching the sky darken with thousands of enemy aircraft, Galland realized that day had arrived. The Allies weren't just winning air superiority, they were owning the sky. They were occupying it like conquered territory, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to take it back. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and looked back at the young pilots gathering near the barracks. They were talking in hushed voices, their faces grim. They were brave, he didn't doubt that, but bravery couldn't overcome mathematics, and the math was brutally simple. For every German plane, the Allies had 10. For every German pilot, the Allies had 20 waiting to take his place. For every liter of fuel Germany could scrape together, the Allies had 1,000. This wasn't a war anymore, it was an execution. And Adolf Galland, who had spent his entire career in the air, who had devoted his life to the Luftwaffe, understood with painful clarity that the war was already lost. Not on the beaches, not in the bunkers, but right here, in the skies above Normandy, where Germany's last hope had just been obliterated in less than 5 minutes.
But here's where the story gets even more tragic. Because even though Galland knew the war was lost, even though he could see it with his own eyes, Berlin refused to accept reality. And that refusal, that stubborn, arrogant denial, would cost thousands more lives in the months to come. Let me show you what happened next.
By midday on June 6th, the airfield was in total chaos. Phones rang non-stop. Messengers ran between tents, clutching reports that were already outdated. Radio operators hunched over their equipment, pale, listening to desperate calls from the front lines. Airfield at Caen under heavy bombardment, runway destroyed. Squadron 7 requesting support, being overwhelmed. Observation Post 14, at least 200 bombers heading inland. Every few minutes, another squadron was lost. Another defensive position called for support that would never come. Galland sat at a table covered in maps. Red arrows showed the Allied advance. Red X's marked destroyed positions. Red circles highlighted areas under bombardment. The maps looked like they were bleeding. His hands, once steady guiding a fighter through impossible maneuvers, trembled as he traced the front lines. Normandy was no longer a point of invasion, it was a gaping wound in Germany's defenses. A young officer whispered, "Fuel reserves, maybe 3 sorties, sir. 4 if we're lucky." 3, Galland repeated, voice hollow. 3 more chances to delay the inevitable. He stepped outside. The roar of engines hit him like a wave. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft filled the sky, patrolling, bombing, overwhelming. 2 battered Messerschmitts limped back to the airfield, pilots barely able to stand, faces smeared with oil and blood. Galland's eyes swept the horizon. These planes, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, were now patched, fragile, running on fumes. He thought of 1939-41, when German air power ruled Europe, when cities fell in hours, when pilots felt invincible. How naive that seemed now. A message from Berlin arrived. Conserve ammunition, do not engage unless critical. Even the high command was quietly conceding defeat. Galland looked up one last time. The Allied aircraft weren't attacking, they were occupying the sky. They owned it, and Germany could no longer fight back. In that moment, he accepted the truth. The war was lost, not on the beaches, not in the bunkers, but here, in the air. Every pilot lost, every plane destroyed, every drop of fuel spent was a step closer to inevitability. And the Allies had the numbers, the machines, and the coordination to win the industrial war Germany had already lost. It was a sobering, heartbreaking clarity, one that defined the fate of the Reich that day. If you want to uncover more untold stories from World War II, see the human side of these moments, and feel history like never before, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for notifications. Join us as we bring these incredible stories from the skies and battlefields to life.